And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه عاش عاش الزارع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فاشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى الآداب القومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И фронт продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along to The World Tonight, brought to you by the Marx Engels Lenin Institute. And tonight we're going to be discussing the often comedic, often psychotic ravings of certain British reactionaries, with particular regard being paid to the war in Ukraine. And we're going to be examining why this particular variety of British reactionary is losing their minds at the moment, over Ukraine especially, but also over Israel. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And that will probably lead to a discussion of various different things involving particularly the Ukraine war. So before we go any further, let's just greet those who have materialized in the chat so far. So James Graham, good evening to you. Arnold, who says good evening from Bridlington. And Muzzle Paint says solidarity. Roddy, Kieran says good evening, and good evening, or good afternoon, I should say, to Martin. And good evening to everyone. Good evening, everyone, says Rob. And Beans says hi as well. So hello to you right back again. So Irish Partisan says good evening, and he's our comrade out in Minsk, which is celebrating the Orthodox Christmas Eve, because of course the Orthodox nations are of course still going on the dates of the old calendar, the old calendar that was phased out of usage during the Russian Revolution, but the Orthodox Christmas and other holidays stuck with their old dates, I think. So, good evening to Laug66, who says, hello, friends. Well, hello back to you. Okay, so before we begin, two pieces of business. I am going to start a ongoing series soon where I'm going to be going through this book. I'm going to hold this up to the camera so you can get a clear view of it. It is Antonio Gramsci, Selections from the Prison Notebooks, and I'm going to be going through the key essays in that because I think there's an awful lot to learn from it. So I'm going to start on tomorrow evening, going through the first essay in this particular edition of the book, and that's entitled The Intellectuals. It's quite a short one, it's only 20 pages long. So going to be going through I'm going to work my way through most of this book over the next few weeks, because I think that there's an awful lot to learn, and also there is a project to be had, shall we say, for Marxist-Leninists of reclaiming Gramsci as one of our own, because for far too long he's been co-opted and his writings have been bastardized by everybody from Khrushchevite revisionists through to right-wing, very right-wing social democrats, through to all kinds of bizarre reactionaries. And so what I thought I would do, and what it would be useful to do, is to work through the book I've got here. So starting with his work on the intellectuals, which I think raises an awful lot of interesting questions with regard to today's society. So that's going to be tomorrow. And then what we'll do is we'll make it a Sunday program. So the Sunday after that, I'm going to be doing the work immediately after that, which is called On Education, another short essay. And then we'll move to then his larger works, which are Notes on Italian History, and then his work on revolutionary party organisation called The Modern Prince, which is, of course, with reference to Machiavelli, and then move to State and Civil Society. And we'll also go through the other big essays here, which are, of course, Notes on Italian History and Americanism and Fordism, and conclude with the philosophy section, the study of philosophy and problems of Marxism. Now, before we start going through that, if you want to read along, please do. The only proviso I would give is that, of course, it takes a little while to get what Gramsci's saying, because, of course, everything is written in a coded phrasing, especially words like terms like class struggle, anything involving Marxism, anything involving workers taking industrial or political action, because, of course, he's writing under a prison censorship regime in fascist era Italy. But I was reading the work, The Intellectuals, earlier on today, and thinking about doing this, and what convinced me to do it was that suddenly I was reading through it, and it made even more sense than the last time I read it, which was a couple of years ago. So, new project to read through the prison notebooks of Gramsci. I think there's an awful lot to be gained from that. So I will be starting that off this time tomorrow evening. So please be sure to join me for that one. Now, moving on then to our agenda in question, which is the ravings of two former colonels in the British Army. A man by the name of Hamish de Breton Gordon, and if that sounds like a joke, well, you should see what he's written. And a more simply named man, former Colonel Richard Kemp. Now, both of these characters are, I believe they're former, Kemp at least is a former tank regiment officer. I'm not sure what regiment de Breton Gordon was in. Maybe the regiment that only allows triple-barreled names in. But both of them have been fulminating away in the more nakedly reactionary sections of the British press. That's, by the way, a very sharp distinction, shall we say, because, of course, the entire British press is reactionary. So when I say nakedly reactionary, I mean those elements of the British press that would call themselves, or whose readers would identify as actual reactionaries. There's no such thing as a non-reactionary bourgeois newspaper or some sort of progressive bourgeois media outlet. No such thing exists. Whether it's the Daily Telegraph, where de Breton Gordon and Richard Kemp write, or whether it's the Guardian with Owen Jones's terminal whinging, you get the same line on Ukraine, whether it's the leftist line, which is curated by state agent Paul Mason, or whether it's the sort of raving pro-imperialist or openly pro-imperialist reactionary line pumped out by Kemp and Gordon. Now, looking at Kemp and Gordon, because they are in some ways a little bit more honest than the likes of Paul Mason, but essentially it's the same kind of argument, but just dressed up differently. Now, what the two of them and others have been babbling on about over the last couple of weeks in article form and on TV and other media appearances is the idea that was actually first expressed by Biden, which is that unless funding is maintained for Ukraine, then America and or Britain might have to go and fight those dastardly Ruskies ourselves. Now, of course, on one level, this is just crude attempts at manipulation of the Congress by Biden or whoever is writing Biden's lines for him. It's just an attempt to try and essentially bully Congress into giving up the game of hardball that they've been playing with the Biden administration, whereby, to quote former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, Speaker of the House, Michael Jackson, or is it Mike Johnson? It doesn't matter either way, has been saying that, or representing the majority view in the Republican leadership now, at least, or the consensus view, which is that they're going to basically try to fuck Biden over and the Democrats over by linking further funding for Ukraine with more funding for the border wall, knowing that eventually they're going to get the money that they want, and that will create even more problems for the Democrats in election year, even with all the problems that the Republicans have with the American federal government trying to actively ban their leading candidate in the form of Donald Trump. But to go back to the point here, Biden was trying this as a way of manipulating Congress. It doesn't seem to have worked, but it's been picked up by British reactionaries of the type represented by the sort of former army colonels who spend a lot of time fulminating in a way and dreaming that it's 1850 all over again. Now, funnily enough, the last time the British Empire actually fought Russia in a war was, of course, the Crimean War in the 1850s. And this is what Kemp and others seem to be fantasizing about. This has also been the fantasy of a gentleman by the name of Tobias Ellwood, another former army officer. I believe he was a captain of some variety or another, who fantasized about waging some kind of naval war in the Black Sea and British troops conquering Sevastopol all over again. Now, funnily enough, over Christmas, I actually watched for the first time the 1969, I believe, Tony Richardson film, The Charge of the Light Brigade, which there is a forthcoming review going out on Patreon about that pretty soon. But what all these mad reactionaries who fantasize about Britain steaming into the Black Sea with our navy that doesn't have enough men in it, with our ships that don't work some of the time, which have got chronically unreliable power generation problems, and with an army that has barely any men in it, and going in there with a good old British stiff upper lip and socking that dastardly Tsar Vladimir I on the jaw, and he falls down dead, and Britain rules the waves all over again. This is, broadly speaking, what occupies the minds of Kemp and De Breton, Gordon and various others. They're mostly fantasists. But, there's a lot of fantasists in the hierarchy of the British bourgeois state. So sadly, they have a constituency. So to conclude the thought about the Crimean War, even though formally speaking, the British coalition won that war, they did so mainly because the Tsarist military organization at that time in the 1850s was so chronically inept, they managed to lose the war from a position of strength. basically. But even so, it was a very close-run thing. The British, as is chronicled in Tennyson's poem and many films about the charge of the Light Brigade, underwent a series of military disasters there, which led to the resignation of the government headed by the Earl of Aberdeen. So it wasn't a particularly glorious victory, nor did it stop the Russian expansion into ultimately aiding the liberation of Bulgaria out from under the rule of the decaying Ottoman Empire. So all of this stuff based on dim reminiscences of the Crimean War and fantasies about the good old British Tommy knocking out the dastardly Ruskies. A lot of this is just fairy tale stuff. But let's for a moment take Kemp and de Breton Gordon seriously and think to ourselves, well, what if they're right? What if the good old British Tommy has to march on Crimea or something like that, or they send some sort of expeditionary force, as Tobias Ellwood had been fantasizing about last year, into the Black Sea? What will be likely to happen? Well, let's start with the basics in terms of this scenario. Let's assume for a moment that the British are going in with some sort of coalition of Europeans. Let's assume, and I think this will be a fairly safe assumption, that the US decides to cut a tacit bargain with the Russians and just slowly exit stage left from Ukraine. Can Britain go it alone, as was being suggested, by the way, by the same collection of reactionaries when the withdrawal from Afghanistan was on the cards? There were suddenly all these Tory MPs and retired colonels in the pages of The Spectator and The Guardian and The Telegraph, screaming and raging away about the need for Britain to stay the course. Of course, the British government didn't stay the course. The British government cut and ran because they can't and couldn't and wouldn't sustain a military operation even against the Taliban on their own without the US backing them up, because the British military is fundamentally incapable of fighting even a low-intensity guerrilla war against a infantry force, which is what the Taliban were. They're not now. They've got an air force thanks to the equipment the US left behind. So would it be the case that the British and the French and the Spanish and the Italians and the Portuguese and the rest of the European countries could lead some sort of heroic charge into Ukraine to save the great democracy of the cocaine clown posse? Well, frankly, no, because it's not only the case that the combined European militaries have got nothing that can significantly endanger the Russian Federation and its armed forces, but also the necessary industrial base to wage the war on Russia just simply doesn't exist. And I'll go into why in just a moment. But first of all, let's do some top-level comparisons. The Russian army, by all accounts, is going to be around about the size of around about 10 times the size of the British Army, 1.3 million men under arms, and that most of this is still in reserve. Most of the fighting in what was once Ukraine is still being done by a lot of units that were in existence prior to February 2022, when the special military operation was launched, because these were the units of the Donbass militias now incorporated into the Russian army. So a lot of the fighting is still being done by them. A lot other bits of it are being done by Chechen forces. There's an awful lot of them. Russian Marines, Russian paratroopers, and volunteer units that have been trained and organized and sent to the front via the Russian military academy down in Grozny. And there's been various different accounts of how many are going through there. There's been claims that they're getting 1,000 volunteers a day, and even if you assume that half of those aren't going to make it through training, then you're still getting 500 a day. That's far more than they're taking in terms of casualties, even according to the Media Zona project that is funded by exiled scumbag oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So straight away, Britain has it, even if you take the most generous measurement of the British Army's numbers, which is 75,000 regular forces, around about 4,500 Gurkha forces, which is the colonial holdover force of Nepalese fighters that were a key part of the old British Imperial Army, and there's been an arrangement there with various governments in Nepal to continue to recruit these Gurkhas from Nepal to fight in the British Army. So you then have 25 or so thousand Army Reserve. So assume then that the most generous measurement of the British land forces is correct, and you have 75,000 regular, 4,000 to 5,000 Gurkhas, and then 25,000 used to be called Territorial Army because the people who run the British government are so pathetic they just copy American titles, so now it's called the Army Reserve. So that's 105 or so thousand. Out of that, they estimate they can get like a fighting force of around about 40,000, because of course not all of those men are frontline soldiers. So the estimates I've seen are that they can get apparently 2 brigades worth of men ready to fight. So that's 40,000 fighting men which could be sent to Ukraine on short notice. And that's assuming then that, of course, they can adequately equip them, which is questionable, given that 20 years ago, when there was the British Army was bigger and had more equipment, they struggled to equip the 10,000 or so men that they sent in to Iraq. I believe it was 10,000. And they struggled to equip them with guns that worked, with boots that didn't melt in the blazing heat, and with a whole variety of other things as well. So assume for a moment that the 40,000 or so men that they can get mobilized and into Ukraine, if the dreams and fantasies of Richard Kemp and Hamish de Bretton Gordon come true. Let's assume that they can get 40,000 in there. Now, how many tanks does the British Army have? Now, the claim being circulated earlier was that it was over 100 Challenger 2 tanks. But when actually questioned about this in the Defence Select Committee, it turned out that the actual number they could get out in the field tomorrow would be between 30 to 40, given that by the admission of the Army commanders, the rest of the tank fleet has been cannibalised. It's why they only sent, I believe it was 12 Challenger 2s to Ukraine, one of which we know has been destroyed. The rest are being held in a warehouse somewhere, I assume, or hidden, so that the British won't be embarrassed by the Russians blowing them all up. So tank forces, assume 30 to 40 at most. So not a terrifically large number. So the other question, of course, is, well, how many tanks do the Russians have? So the number there is at least into the thousands and thousands, and even that's even by the estimates of those who are the enemies of Russia. Now, the whole question of this, I mean, it's obviously not just a question of numbers, because the Russians have, again, according to figures released by partly by the Russian Ministry of Defense, and these others are estimates of what they have active. So they still have an unknown number of old T-54s and 55s, which are being used as basically self-propelled guns now. So they're not being used actively in tank battles. They got around 800 T-62s, which have been modernized and brought up to date in terms of their operating systems. The gun's been updated. It's been, a lot of the systems in it have been computerized. They got 700 T-64s, which are still active. They have 2,000 or so T-72s, but apparently they have 8,000 of them in storage because, of course, the productive capacity of the military industries in the old Soviet Union was enormous, and the old Red Army was of such a great size that they had an enormous amount of tanks left over when Yeltsin destroyed all of that, and a huge number of them are in storage. So you would then get the more modern T-80, which was, of course, designed in the late period Soviet Union. They have between 480 to 500 of those that are currently active, and apparently 3,000 in storage, and 750 T-90s, which are the most modern variant of the Russian battle tank, which was designed post-Soviet Union. So if you just take a look at that, the Russians have around about, if we just do a quick add up there, 3,000, over 4,000, 4,500 active tanks. If you take like the active tanks to be everything from the T-62 to the T-90, and an unknown number of T-54s, 55s, which they use as fixed-placed artillery units now. So hopelessly outnumbered. If Britain, even if you assume that all that Russia's got active in there is only around about a third of the total number that I've just gone through there, Britain's 30 to 40 tanks, absolutely no chance against the sheer weight of numbers that the Russians have. And also the Russian tanks have been revealed to be actually very efficient on the battlefield. So no chance when it comes to a tank battle. No chance when it comes to an infantry battle, because also let's not just take this in terms of numbers. Let's also look at training and experience of the armies in question here. The Russian army, written off by the so-called experts in the West for so long because of the effects of the Soviet collapse, its relatively poor performance in the first Chechen war, though I would argue that that was a combined effect of demoralization following the collapse of the Soviet state and the treachery of Yeltsin, and that the collapse in the 90s was slowly repaired in the Putin era, to the point where now the Russians have the most battle-tested officers and men of any army anywhere in the world, other than perhaps the Syrian Arab army. And of course, they'd been getting decent experience before the special military operation in Syria, but now, of course, they've been battling the NATO-organized Ukrainian forces for nearly 2 years. And of course, as I said earlier, a core part of that army is the Luhansk and Donetsk militia units that became regular forces when they were incorporated into the Russian army. So you have a lot of very battle-hardened officers and men in the Russian army now. And on top of that, you have them, the Russian training courses for their infantry units seem to be a lot more comprehensive than whatever it is that the NATO forces have in place. So the Russian army is better equipped than the British army. It is better trained than the British army, and it has an infinitely greater experience. What experience does the British army have over the last, well, let's take it since World War II. They went into Korea and got kicked around by the Chinese and the Koreans. They fought a brutish colonial war in Malaysia, which was a success, even though they had to retreat from Malaysia ultimately, offering it a form of independence. They lost an insurgency in Yemen. They were forced out of a series of other colonies despite an awful lot of brutality being practiced. They just about managed to beat the conscript forces of the Argentine military regime in 1982, and that was a closer run thing than the British Army would admit to. The Argentines could have beaten them, but I think a combination of the fact that the military regime was falling apart, its forces were ill-trained and ill-motivated, and apparently the British convinced the French to shaft the Argentines by essentially giving them the cancellation codes for the Exocet missiles that the French had sold the Argentines, which were, in the early days of the war, doing severe damage to the British naval force that was down there. So you can chalk that up as a win, but barely. And then, of course, were there a junior partner in the war against the Iraq in 1991, which is basically involved bombing Iraq for months on end, and then when the Iraqi forces went to leave, bombing them as they tried to drive back to Iraq. So not much of a glorious victory there. Then you get various so-called peacekeeping, in reality occupation force police action missions against Yugoslavia, and you have, of course, the ongoing war and military occupation of the northern 6 counties of Ireland, which, by the way, was a war the British Army didn't win. They couldn't beat the IRA, despite the fact that they'd tried. They couldn't uproot it. So in the end, they had to secure a victory with the assistance of American imperialism at the negotiating table. So the British occupation of the north of Ireland still stands, but the IRA was not militarily defeated. So then you have Afghanistan, Iraq, essentially occupation force work, slaughtering civilians, that kind of thing. So the British Army hasn't actually had to fight somebody who you could describe, to use the modern term, as a peer competitor since 1945, since the old days of the British Empire Army fighting the Germans. So you just simply do not have any of the experience necessary amongst the men or the officer corps in the British, not just the British Army, but the British Navy, the British Air Force, that would enable them to take on the Russian army. And that's before, of course, we get to the other point here about numbers, which is, of course, that without air cover, we've seen what happens to NATO-trained forces when they go up against the Russians, which is we've learned from the counter-offensive. So no, sorry, my incorrect term. The offensive staged by Ukrainian forces in June of the last year, which is that they ended up getting slaughtered. So what kind of air cover do the British Armed Forces have? Well, they have just over 100 aircraft. Mainly, the main aircraft now is the Eurofighter, co-developed project that had been in development hell for decades. And apparently it's a fairly decent aircraft, but the British don't have an enormous amount of them. Now, if you compare that to the size of the Russian aerospace forces, you can see again that there is a gigantic gap in terms of quantity. Now, the total aircraft that the Russian aerospace forces have available to them is just over 4,000. So, but let's go and look at the actual numbers involved here. So you see that the number of actual fighters, etc., and aircraft that could be used in warfare is enormous. So bear in mind, the British have just over 100 fighter and multi-role aircraft. Currently in service for the Russians, you have 253 MiG-29s, and these are defined by the military magazine Jane's as multi-role fighter or multi-role aircraft. So 40-year-old plane, MiG-29, they got 253 of them in service. MiG-31s, 129. MiG-35s, more modern aircraft, 6. Sukhoi 27s, 391. Sukhoi 30s, 110. Sukhoi 34s, 149. Sukhoi 35s, 118. Sukhoi 57, 32. And then you have two forms of what are defined as attack aircraft. Sukhoi 24. Again, that's a slightly older aircraft. That's from 1975, but there's 273 of them. And Sukhoi 25, slightly more modern, 1981 model, 192 of them. So, again, no chance. No chance at all. Not only are they are vastly outnumbered by the Russian aerospace forces, but the quality of the Russian jets, both the older ones designed in the period of the USSR and the more modern ones, is acknowledged even by the enemies of the Russian Federation as being far superior to a lot of what you find in the West. So it's a complete mismatch. And even if we throw in the Spanish, the French, the Germans, the Portuguese, the Italians, let's throw in the Poles as well. Combine all of their mismatched armies together. Would you even come up with enough men to deploy in Ukraine? Well, you might be able to put together enough men to cause the Russians to have to deploy more forces there. But bear in mind, again, their army's approaching 1.3 million. The Bundeswehr is, by all accounts, one of the worst armies in Europe. The French army isn't that much better. It's slightly larger. The rest of the European armies, I mean, the Italian army is around about 90,000 strong. Spanish army ain't about much. Neither is the Portuguese. None of these have fought a serious war for decades. Like the last war the Spanish army actually fought that was a war of any severity was the Spanish Civil War. And that was, of course, an internal war. Portuguese, even longer back into the history. Italy, of course, on the losing side of World War II, hasn't fought anything serious since then. There is nobody in all of the European armed forces from the leadership level, from general level, through to the junior officer level, who has any experience whatsoever of fighting the kind of war that Colonels Kemp and de Bretton Gordon are fantasizing about. The experience just doesn't exist. Nor does the experience exist in the Navy. There's been no real experience of fighting a peer competitor in the British Royal Navy for years. And again, Air Force hasn't experienced having to fight an opponent with an Air Force and very well developed air defense system since World War II. And then let's go further. Let's say for a moment that, again, Colonels Kemp and de Bretton Gordon get their way and they go and send their expeditionary force to Ukraine. Okay, well, even by the admissions of the, again, British generals testifying to the Defense Select Committee, the Russian S-400 system, air defense system, would shoot down most of the Air Force within a couple of weeks if they deployed it to Ukraine. And not only that, they'd shoot down the AWACS systems that the British and the Europeans have access to. So, and which again, they're flying around these things around the borders of Ukraine and on the Romanian end of the Black Sea, unperturbed at the moment. That wouldn't be the case if suddenly these idiots decided that they wanted to go to war for real. And so, okay, so let's go with the testimony of the British senior officers who said that they would lose most of the Air Force inside 2 weeks to Russian air defense. Can British industry cope with having to replace all of these Eurofighters that will get shot down? And the answer is no. The British defense industry, as it stands at the moment, does not have the capacity to produce en masse in a way that would be required if you got into a shooting war with the Russians. Now, bear in mind that, again, the last time the British had to do this, which is to be able to keep an air force in the sky and replace daily the planes shot down on a mass basis, was, of course, 1940-41. The period of the Battle of Britain, where the Air Force was battling the Luftwaffe in the skies above southern England. And that required an enormous commitment from the British government to essentially take over the running of all of the factories that were associated with aircraft production. Because, as I've said on numerous occasions before now, when they were managed by the private sector, they were just incapable of meeting the needs of an air force that was losing tens of planes a day. And if they hadn't have taken it over and essentially instituted a version of a planned economy there and kept the workshops essentially running round the clock with different shifts of workers coming on and train new workers, including an awful lot of women workers who were brought on to replace men who'd been drafted, they would have lost that battle because the private sector management was just simply not up to the task of producing the number of aircraft that they needed. Now, aircraft have come on in terms of technology and complexity since 1940. Is it possible to rapidly produce Eurofighter Typhoons? My guess is at the moment the British simply don't have the capacity to do that, nor do the Germans, who of course were co-sponsors of the Eurofighter projects, or does anybody else that was involved with it, such as the Spanish or the Italians. So nobody's got the capacity to mass produce these Eurofighters if they were all lost when they went up against Russian air defense. Nor does Britain have the capacity to replace any naval losses that it would sustain in a war against the Russians. And we know this because the British government has essentially admitted it. In 2022, they released a renewed strategy for naval shipbuilding in Britain. By 2017, it had become obvious due to the closures of naval shipyards in places like Portsmouth, which had been building and maintaining Royal Navy ships for centuries. A lot of that capacity was closed down all the way through the 1980s, and it was really shrunk back in the 1990s and 2000s, till by the time they reached 2017, the Brits suddenly realized they didn't have anything like enough shipyards to upgrade their naval forces or even to maintain what they had. So they suddenly developed an industrial strategy, or pulled one out of their orifice, in 2017. They had to revisit it in 2022 because they'd gone 5 years and hadn't achieved anything, or hadn't achieved much. So now there's this 2022 document, which if there's a demand for it, I might go through it in the future, which is online on the British government's website. You can look at it on there. I read through the executive summary earlier today. A lot of talk about ambitions. Britain is a great seafaring and trading nation. We must have a industrial base that can match that in terms of shipbuilding, especially for the purposes of defence. So they've set up, the British government has, a series of bodies to oversee a renewal of shipbuilding in Britain, because they let it go to the wall for, well, probably since the early 1960s was when you started seeing the Clydeside shipbuilders go bust, and then they just let everywhere go bang one after the other. So they let Harland and Wolff in Belfast go pop mainly. It's still there, but on a much reduced scale. They let the Newcastle shipbuilding industry go under. They've got very limited capacity to actually build and replace naval vessels. They ended up giving a lot of naval contracts to Japanese shipyards. So they've realized that they've got a problem, but all they've done so far is produced a paper and said, oh, we want to cooperate with the private sector on this. And so far, the private sector's basically sat there and said, well, give us a load of money and we'll consider it. So they've recognized, the British government's recognized that it has a problem in industrial capacity terms, but they've spent 5 years essentially trying to persuade the private sector to do it. and so far, no luck that we can see. The other thing is, of course, the question of materials you need to actually power an industrial base that would be able to replace the war material that you would get destroyed in the first few weeks of your great expedition against the Russian devil in Ukraine. So you would need to have a steel industry at the bare minimum to actually aid your military industrial complex and produce metal for it. And you would need a chemical industry domestically to produce munitions. And neither of those things we have to any great degree. There is something of a chemical industry in Britain. There's slightly more of that than there is certain other industries. So, but there's nowhere near the capacity that you'd need to actually produce munitions on the scale needed for a war against a major country, because again, there's just been no requirement for it since the 1980s. So again, like the British government's been talking about increasing the amount of production of M777 howitzers, for instance. But again, like they don't have the supply chain in place to produce that en masse, and they don't have. They only have one factory that could conceivably produce the Challenger tank, and it's not been producing Challenger tanks for decades. Again, they don't have the factory set up, nor do they have the supply chain. Britain's not even in the top 10, or even I think they're number 28 in terms of the amount of steel produced per year. It's 7.2 million tons of steel is produced inside Britain per year. Now, you compare that to the numbers in the top 10. I mean, the US is still in the top 10, but China far and away outstrips everybody else. It's followed by India. I think Russia's like number 8. They produce enough steel domestically, I think, to meet their defense needs, and they even export some now. So their steel industry's actually undergone a rebirth since the 1990s. So again, our steel industry is closing down. You've got like threats to the steel plants perpetually that still exist down in South Wales and in the northeast of England. So again, like the government says, oh, well, we've got a problem, we're not producing enough of X, Y, or Z. And then because they absolutely refuse to even take the steps that even an old reactionary like Churchill was forced to do in the 1940s, they just leave it in the hands of the private sector who scale it back and close it down. And then the government and Paul Mason whinge that, oh, well, we've not got a steel industry anymore. What happened? So, again, not enough of a chemical industry, nowhere near enough of a steel industry. And let's turn to energy. Why is there a perpetual energy crisis in Britain? Well, part of the reason is that British capitalism just simply doesn't produce enough anymore. Again, this is the Tories, the governing party, suddenly woke up a couple of years ago and realized that they were having to import a lot of energy from continental Europe, and they said, oh, well, we'll introduce a new project where we're going to build, I believe it's 5 new nuclear power stations across the country by, is it 2030 perhaps? I doubt they're going to make that target. They never do. And well, they're not going to come on for at least another 6 years, if that. And you've still got North Sea oil producing a certain amount, but would the amount that's extracted via the North Sea oil fields be enough to cover the demands of wartime industry? Doesn't seem to be the case on the current scale of production. And then look further afield. So we don't have enough energy being produced in the country. Assume also that if you go into war with the Russians, you end up with attacks on your shipping, and not just from the Russians, by the way. All the Russians would need to do to really fuck up Britain's supply chains as they currently stand is maybe just feed a few anti-ship missiles of a more advanced variety to the Yemenis, for instance, who could easily screw with a lot of British shipping in and around the Red Sea area, with the Red Sea area, which of course now looks a lot more vacant since a lot of the shipping firms are diverting via the Horn of Africa. So your shipping lanes would then be under threat everywhere if you decided you wanted to have a war with a major country like Russia. And given that we import 42% of all food that is consumed in Britain comes from overseas that has to be shipped in, and we don't have the agricultural capacity as things stand right now to replace that. They did manage to make the land more efficient in World War II by introducing radical agricultural techniques, which it might be worth going into those in the future. But as things stand at the moment, the land is not utilized to anything like the efficient degree you would need to replace any food supplies that got cut off if supply chains were disrupted. So let's just recap. The British Armed Forces do not have the men. They're also, by the way, going through a recruitment crisis. They can't replace the men that are leaving the service. They can't fully crew their naval vessels that they have out in the Red Sea at the moment. They don't have the necessary supply chains in place to keep those vessels at sea for an extended period of time. Nor, by the way, does the United States. They did away with their supply ships apparently in the 90s and the late 80s. So they don't have the capacity to keep ships at sea. They don't have the men necessary to form a force that could actually pose any kind of significant threat to the Russian forces that are even on the ground right now in Ukraine. They don't have trained officers who could stand a chance of going up against the officer corps of the Russian armed forces. Their men have only experience in shooting peasants in Afghanistan. The Donbass militias would chew them up and spit them out. And they don't have an air force that could stand against the Russian air defense system for more than a couple of weeks. They don't have enough ships, they don't have enough planes. And more than that, they don't have the industrial capacity to replace anything that gets downed or sunk. They don't have enough industrial capacity to produce enough tanks to go up against the Russians. The tank fleet is tiny and dwarfed by what the Russians have available to them. And I would guess now it's fairly obvious that whether it's a T-62, a T-72, a T-80 or a T-90, most of those Russian tanks are superior to anything that the Western Europeans have got available to them. So, not enough men, not enough trained men, not the equipment shit, the leadership's god-awful, the industrial base just doesn't exist to replace what you'd lose. The supply chains, because British capitalism has stretched its supply system all over the world, would be under threat, and you wouldn't be able to actually switch over production quickly enough to make up for shortfalls. And you're already going through a crisis of legitimacy in terms of the British capitalist state's legitimacy in the eyes of not just the working class, but even large segments of the petty bourgeoisie. Does this really look like a country that could go to war against the Russians, who have now got the most experienced and probably the best equipped army on earth? No. And by the way, everything I've said about Britain applies even more to like Italy or Spain or Portugal, who, as Irish Partisan has pointed out in the chat, Portuguese haven't fought a war since the colonial wars in Africa in 61 to 75, which, by the way, they lost. And you could argue, well, the Germans have a lot more industrial capacity, so they could, in theory, turn that towards building up their army. But the Germans are confronted with a similar problem to that which confronted the failed Austrian watercolour artist himself back in the 40s, which is that Germany doesn't actually have a lot of domestic energy. Now, even less so since they shut down their coal mines and shut down their nuclear plants. So one of the problems confronting the Third Reich itself was a lack of oil fields, which is why, of course, they were allied with, I believe there was oil fields in Romania, and it's why they were desperate to get hold of the oil industry in Soviet Azerbaijan and the Soviet Central Asian nations. They were desperate to get hold of that. So, again, the Germans have a severe problem. They've been cut off from Russian energy. They don't produce enough of their own energy to power the industrial capacity that will be required to revolutionize the production of tanks and other military equipment for the Bundeswehr. And you can forget the the Nordic countries stepping into the breach on that as well. What these countries produce, I mean, they do produce some military equipment, which is, by accounts of those who know about these things, quite good in like Sweden and Finland and Norway and Denmark. But it's an industry which is based around producing like a few models of these a year for sale and export. Nothing, not production on a gargantuan industrial scale that would be needed when you lose all of your currently existing equipment inside a week, which is what would happen. So again, none of the necessary components that would be required for these dickheads that run the European states to have their fantasy war against Russia exist. And by the way, they don't exist in places like Poland either. Yeah, the Duda and Morawiecki recruited more men to the Polish army, but they didn't expand significantly the Polish industrial base. And if the Poles decided that they wanted to roll into Ukraine and try and recreate the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth against the Russians, well, the Russians aren't going to spare them. Let's return to a crucial point, which hasn't been emphasized anything like enough. What the Russians are doing in Ukraine is still a special military operation. It is not war to any great extent. Even with the missile attacks on military installations in Kharkov and Kiev and other places, the Russians are still operating on in a genuinely constrained fashion, as set by the political outcomes desired of this special military operation, set by the leadership in the Kremlin and enforced by the leadership of the Russian armed forces. It's still not a war. They're not doing to Kiev what the Israelis have done to Gaza, for instance. But should the Europeans be stupid enough to wander into a war against the Russians, they won't spare the cities of Europe. Why would they? They are trying to counter the fascist forces in Ukraine in order that ultimately, when this is done, and I've talked about the potential outcomes here in the previous shows, that when this is done, that they can bring the bulk of Ukraine that was, again, look at the border of the Russian Empire from 1914 in that region. That is where the Russian advance will ultimately stop. It may take another year to get there, depending upon whether the Ukrainian state collapses or not. But the ultimate aim is to take back all Russian lands into Russian management again. And they want to do that by, again, being able to incorporate the population and not have the population be bitter and hostile for many generations, which is why they're going to leave Western Ukraine well alone and allow the Poles and the Hungarians and the Slovakians to bicker and argue about what to do with it. So, again, we're not even, what is being done in Ukraine, even though it's killing many hundreds of thousands, is still not a war that would be imposed upon Europe should our leaders decide that it's time for a great and glorious crusade in defense of Western civilization. So, it's certainly the case in Britain, as even the British government has at least partially recognized now. They just don't have the industrial capacity to fight the Russians. They don't have the military capacity, nor does the rest of Europe, nor even does the United States, truth be told. They've got more men, they've got more equipment, they've got an air force which is roughly equivalent, at least in size, to the Russian Air Force. And arguably, they've got still superior naval force in terms of the US submarine fleet. But without the US, again, there is no NATO to be had. And even with the US, in terms of ground forces in Europe, that's still not enough to take on and beat the Russian army, which, again, is the strongest, most experienced, best equipped land army in the world right now. So the dreams of Colonel Kemp and Colonel de Bretton Gordon are absurd. They are insane. The only reason why that these two idiots are allowed to spout this crap out in the open is because, of course, what they're doing is they're trying ultimately to keep pressure on the United States. What British are desperate to do, and this has even made its way into mainstream or bourgeois art and bourgeois movies in the past, is that there's this perpetual fear inside the British ruling class that one day the American ruling class are basically going to say, we're going to withdraw from Europe. We're going to focus either on the Pacific area or keeping hold of what they regard as their territories in Latin America and the Caribbean. And they're going to essentially pull their backing from British imperialism. And without that backing, British imperialism is fucked. And without that backing, European imperialism is even more fucked than it is now. And so what they're trying to do, of course, is they're trying to whip up the idea of the imminent Russian invasion. America must stand with us, because they're terrified that ultimately the US is going to walk. Now, I don't think that's going to happen for a number of reasons, not immediately. I think it will ultimately happen, but I think a lot will have to change in the US before that we get to that point. And we can discuss that on programs in the future. So I'll pause now to take in some comments. Colonels Kemp and de Bretton Gordon remind me of Colonel Clink and Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes. Not a program I've seen, Irish Partisan, though I'm told it's very famous. I did see the photo you posted earlier. It looked amusing. Pittsburgh dude says, you mean Prince Harry in a helicopter couldn't defeat the Taliban? Well, maybe he could if we sent him back in, and I'm willing to do that. If Prince Harry wants to reclaim his manhood that has been taken from him by his wife, he can find his ginger testicles again and go and try and defeat the Taliban mano a mano, and I'm sure that it would come out okay for him. Banana Bender says, last British-led victory anyway was the Falklands, and that was against Argentina. Well, and as I said, barely a victory, really. They just about got away with it. Irish Partisan says, quoting Bismarck, if Lord Palmerston sends the British Army to Germany, I shall have the police arrest them. Good quote from Bismarck, and at the time he said that would have been entirely correct observation. The British have never been, for all the hype about the victories in World War I and World War II, British were always a naval-based power. They didn't really, at the peak of their empire, which wasn't in the early 20th century, it was actually in the middle of the 19th, when it was at its most powerful, their actual land armies weren't that big. They relied on local forces in India through the British East India Company. They didn't rely on a vast land army. They relied on their naval forces. The reserve reactionary militias, to answer T.D. Mallard's point, reserve reactionary militias, yes, such things would be mobilized in Britain as they would in many other imperialist countries if they were under threat of revolution. But I'm talking here about purely forces they could deploy to try and fight their fantasy war against the Russians. Such things would be mobilized for internal repression, not deployment externally. They're not going to send the loyalist the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, to go and fight the Russians. Though they did mobilize its predecessor organization to try and fight the Germans, and they all got wiped out, I believe, at the Somme. A lot of them did anyway. Muzzle Paint says, is it possible that some of the operational level command and control occurring on the US carriers elsewhere is a prep for large US-led NATO operations in Ukraine? No. And I will elaborate as to why I do not think that that's going to happen. Because all the things I said about the British Army's inability to fight the Russians, they apply slightly less to the US. But what does apply to the US is that their commanders just aren't up to scratch. They would not be prepared to fight the Russian army. They would lose badly, and a lot of them I think the senior men know it as well. So they haven't done it so far. I think that they're still not going to do it. I think that the Russians are managing this conflict in such a way as to do two things. One, of course, which is bring the special military operation to a triumphant conclusion. But the way in which they're going about that is deliberately slow, and they're deliberately drawing it out, partly to avoid mass casualties on their own side. And that's been enabled by the fact that the NATO commanders have had the Ukrainians pursuing really stupid tactics. But also, I think, because I think the Russians would like the Ukrainian state to remain operative up to the point when they're ready to essentially take over all the territory that they want. They don't want. I don't think that they want the US just to collapse it and run away, because that would actually leave them with more problems than they have now. I think what they'd like to do is just to erode it and erode it and erode it until the point where they're ready to fully take over the territories that they want to actually grab. So I think that the war is going to continue on for. I think it's going to continue on for most of the rest of this year, basically, in Ukraine, because of the way that the Russians are choosing to approach it. There will be Russian offensives, but I think that they are just going to seek to continue grinding both the Ukrainians and NATO down as a whole, until we reach the point where the Russians, as we discussed on a previous live stream last week, until the point where the Russians can get the demands they expressed in those draft treaties from 2021, until they can get those demands met, the special military operation will continue to the point, unless, of course, the Ukrainian state collapses and the Americans just cut and run. But as I said, I think the Russians want to continue wearing down NATO for a good while yet. And they have a budget in place to do that. Their budget for this war runs until 2025, apparently. So another year. Makumi says, comments on the Royal Navy posting jobs on LinkedIn as it seeks to hire a new rear admiral for the submarine fleet. It's been called shameful by British military sources. I mean, do they not have anybody inside? I mean, this was done also in the police, the British police force. They started doing this thing where they were trying to hire senior officers from the private sector, which is just insane. I mean, like the idea that you could suddenly go from being a senior manager for Amazon and then just go to managing the submarine fleet. I mean, it doesn't make any fucking sense. It's done by people who are... It's management of organizations done by people who think that business management skills are translatable into every single field of human activity, when they're just not, of course. But this is the institutional bias in the British state. All the people who are in the senior positions are all either like men who have been like IT contractors or HR contractors or like senior project managers. And their bias is towards like recruiting people who are just like them, even for positions in the military. I mean, that's a typical example of just how insane the British bureaucracy's gone. 2 BAE yards on the Clyde plus Fastlane submarine base. Yes, one of the reasons why, of course, the British government will never agree to Scottish independence. Too many military assets inside Scotland, including nuclear weapons, I believe. Hello to Tusker, who's joined us, and good evening to Jay from, I believe, Norfolk, Virginia. So that brings us to the conclusion of the program for tonight. Be sure to join me for tomorrow, where we'll be doing the first section of the book, The Prison Notebooks by Gramsci, and that's going to be on the essay entitled The Intellectuals. So join me for that, 8 p.m. British time tomorrow. Thank you to everybody who's come along tonight, and I will return you to your musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد جيل من شعب مجاهد عاش يبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاش يبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش جيل ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجند العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь